Hello all, and thank you for joining us for OWM in Conversation. Today's topic is going to be about how to find your voice as a young journalist. My name's Gemma Bradshaw. I'm the director of One World Media, and I'm delighted to be able to bring you some of our nominees from this year's One World Media Awards. This year, the One World Media Awards 2020 will be an online exhibition, and we're thrilled to be able to have this series of events throughout the day to talk to some of our nominees and hear more about their stories and their careers. So the awards is designed to celebrate the very best media coverage of developing countries and is now in its 32nd year. And if you want to hear more about the rest of the events today, or take a look at some of the nominees' work, then you can find it all on our website, and the details are in the video description below. So to today's conversation, I'm joined by three of our nominees for the New Voice Award. I'm thrilled to be able to share this moment with you all and get to chat to you all. Thank you all for being here, and congratulations, of course, for being nominated. And so we're joined by three brilliant journalists, and I'm going to just do a quick introduction so that you know who you're listening to before we start the first question. So we have with us Naseh Shaker. He's based in Yemen. He's been covering the conflict there and really showing the human cost of what's been happening in Yemen now for many, many years, and in particular showing the impact on children who are often caught in the crosshairs. We're also joined by Shatha Hammad. Shatha is based in Palestine. The jury noted that her work really showed the Palestinian experience. In particular, they highlighted one story from a US Democratic representative, which went on to become a worldwide phenomenon and hashtag, I believe, but really showing the implications of travel restrictions in Palestine. And also we're joined by Oscar Lopez, based in Mexico. He is America's correspondent for the Thomson Reuters Foundation, and his work on environmental and human rights covers a whole range of topics, but in particular, his work on the HIV drug shortage in Mexico was highlighted. So thank you all for your work and for all of your stories. So I'd like to start by hearing a bit more about the kinds of stories that you all focus on and what draws you towards those. Oscar, could I start with you? You cover a broad area. Your remit is, I think, you've worked across Latin America, Nigeria. You also mentioned you're working in America as well. So I just wondered what it was particularly about these stories that inspired you.
Yeah, I mean, I think what drew me to journalism was the ability to give a voice to people that often aren't heard. And I think that's what I have loved about my work and working with the foundation, is really having a focus on vulnerable communities that most of the time we don't hear from because they're not, anywhere near the centers of power or decision making, but often are the ones suffering the most by those decision makers. So that's really always been the focus of my work, is trying to elevate those people who often could benefit from having more of a spotlight shone on the struggles that they're going through. And so whether it's women in Nigeria or people living with HIV in Mexico, they're not people that you necessarily hear from that often. So being able to use my work to amplify theirs or their voices is really, I guess, what inspires me.
Could you tell us a little more about, in particular, the how you got involved in the drug shortages story? How did that come?
Yeah, I mean, as like a lot of my stories, they start with being plugged into networks and social media. And so I started seeing a lot of people on social media saying, there's a drug shortage, I don't have enough medicine. People in my network kind of starting to make those sorts of comments. And obviously for people living with HIV, not having access to antiretroviral drugs can be really life-threatening in some cases. So it definitely felt like an important story. And obviously it was important to find that sort of proof. So also by going through social media and being able to talk to doctors on the ground, I could kind of find that documentary evidence showing that there was indeed drug shortages in various clinics across the country. And so by putting together the kind of first-person stories of people who were experiencing the shortages, as well as the documentary evidence that this was happening, I was able to kind of shine a light on a really serious issue.
Yeah, thank you. And Naseh, your work has followed some of the bombings in Yemen and some really difficult stories. How did you get involved in those?
Well, actually, I was inspired by covering several of the stories that I nominated for this award, and specifically when the children came under attack, as I already told, and as I mentioned in my application, a lot of children, a lot of journalists, a lot of humanitarian aid providers or volunteers. When you saw school bus children being targeted by a missile in a crowded market in early morning, you get inspired by the children carrying their backpacks, and you will find the perpetrator saying, "We have just directed the missile launchers," while you see they are carrying UNICEF backpacks. You get inspired to cover such stories, okay? And the injustice that a lot of people, be it journalists here in Yemen or as I told you, the for humanitarian volunteers who were arrested at their homes while after returning from providing humanitarian aid in a country where it is considered as world's worst humanitarian crisis. So there are several stories. I was inspired by covering them, especially as I told you, children. There were a girl that was the sole survivor of her family, her parents, and 5 siblings who were killed in an attack on their home in Sana'a. And then her struggle returned. She was about 5 years old and was named or designed as the eye of humanity, because she struggled to open her eye in the hospital, and she was crying, "Where is my father?" or singing, "Where is my mother? Where is my father?" When I go to the street, I find children hitting me. So it is very hard to watch these events and not try to cover them.
Yeah, no, I think you're bearing witness on some very difficult scenes, and that comes through in your stories. And Shatha, how have you been involved in the stories that you were nominated for?
Okay. What inspired me to work on my story was the search for the small untold details in the big story, like the Rashida Tlaib story. I wanted to dive deeper, and I always feel that we have a right to know every piece of information. In another hand, I decided to bring in not just the political aspect of the Israel protective Rashida from entering the West Bank, but also the social and the humanitarian aspect, the story of her village, family, and home.
Thank you, Shatha. It looks like you're having some internet difficulties, but we're going to move on with the next question. Hopefully you can rejoin us. So I just wanted to hear from all of you about taking a step back. What do you think, what was your break into journalism? When did you know you were on the right track? What was your break? Naseh, do you want to explain?
Yeah, actually, to answer this question, I need to take you back to the 2001 during the war in Afghanistan. My father used to tell me before I go to bed that in the early morning, instead of going to a street or the farm, as I was living in a rural village in central Yemen, he told me in the early morning I need to memorize the BBC Arabic radio bulletin. At the time, there was no cell phones, no internet, and no TVs. Only we were listening to radio. At the time, I was about 11 years old, and in the early morning, I tried to memorize the bulletin, but it was very hard for me to even understand a lot of the words in the BBC Arabic bulletin. I was able to memorize words like warplanes, attacks, soldiers, missile attack on Kandahar or in Kabul, words like this. And I tried to report the bulletin for my father on the breakfast. And I think he was just telling us there will be a prize, but he also bought me another radio. Okay, that was the prize. And then I give the second break was in 2011 during the protest against the President Ali Abdullah Saleh that toppled him the protest. And I was watching several events firsthand. Okay. So I went to English journalism, the Yemen Times newspaper, the supplemental education at this new English newspaper chose me as the best young Yemeni writer for my contributions to this supplemental education when I was the first year of English department. And then when the war broke out in Yemen in 2015, I found a lot of events. I found events that happened, in front of me, okay, firsthand. And just my first break into international English media was in 2018. And as I mentioned, it was the school bus attack when I broke into Al Jazeera English with a featured story. And then in the early 2019, I joined about more than 5 news international media outlets. And that's it.
Yeah, so a long journey, always focused on the news. Oscar, were you focused on the news at a young age also?
No, actually, I came from a background working in the theater. Okay. So I always was very interested in theater, and that's actually why I moved to New York, was to pursue theater. But I was interested in a kind of theater called documentary theater or verbatim theater, where instead of just writing a play, you go out into the community and interview people about a specific topic. And then based on those interviews and the transcripts of those interviews, you create a theater piece. And I was working with a theater company in New York who did this kind of work. And then I actually formed my own company and started doing this kind of creation. And that process of doing the interviews and putting together a story, I just found really, really interesting. And I'd never really thought of a career in journalism, but in a way I was doing journalism. And I guess I got a little bit frustrated with the amount of time it takes, to create this kind of work. And journalism kind of had that immediacy of being able to do the interviews and then publish something straight away. And when I discovered it, I just kind of was hooked. And doing that kind of work, sort of slowly building up my portfolio, I guess, is kind of how I got my first job and started working up from there. But I guess in terms of a break, oftentimes with journalism, it's about being in the wrong place at the right time. And in 2015, I happened to be in Paris on the night of the terrorist attacks there. And I'd been freelancing for a couple months and, kind of trying to get my name out there a little bit, kind of struggling. And then all of a sudden I was at the center of this global news story, kind of running around the streets of Paris, trying to see what was going on and filing stories and things like that. And then suddenly I was on CNN and MSNBC and all these things. And I think that was kind of where I started to establish myself a little more and get more of a foothold in the industry.
Okay. So did you have the contacts before and then you were just able to
I had some contacts. I was working for Newsweek at the time, but most of the people reached out to me. So the CNN and the BBC and things like that kind of found me, and then I was able to kind of leverage that to finding other contacts and kind of building up my network that way.
Yeah. Shatha,
can you tell us how you got your first break in journalism?
My first opportunity working in the media was at a new website that focused on community journalism in Jerusalem. A few months after I graduated from university, most of staff did not have journalistic experience, so we built on our abilities as a group and individually.
And
I want to say that I was the only females with the 4 men, and that always made me feel inferior. This pushed me to double my offers, work long hours, and volunteer to work in holidays.
Okay, you did so much. And now you are a freelance journalist, is that right?
Yes, I am a freelance journalist from 5 years.
All 3 of you are freelance journalists, and I think that's a really difficult position that you're having to build that network and contacts constantly, as well as looking for the stories. And it's a challenging industry to do that. So I was interested in what you saw as the challenges, but also what are the good parts, what keeps you going, so that it's not all difficult. Oscar, do you want to say something about that?
Sure. I mean, I think the challenge is often just being on your own, not having the backing of a newsroom or a support network. So especially when you're a young journalist and you're not entirely sure what makes a good story, it can be challenging to just feel on your own without any kind of mentor or supervision. It's challenging also just from a cost benefit position. You know, it's very hard often to, you know, get your stories pitched and published and then get them paid on time. So often financially it's definitely a struggle, and pay rates for freelancers have been pretty stagnant for a while. So I definitely think the financial aspect is a challenge. But I think one of the things I love most about freelancing is with being alone also comes independence. And it's been really liberating to be able to sort of really make my own path and choose the stories that I'm most interested in. Oftentimes when you are working in a newsroom, you have to write a certain amount of stories, and there's kind of a bit of pressure there. Whereas I think as a freelancer, I've been able to spend a lot longer developing a story and really get into a community and choose where I want to report, what I want to write about. And I think that freedom to really write the stories that I'm most passionate about has been what's kept me motivated to keep going despite the struggles that come along the way.
Yeah, thank you. And Shatha?
Yes, there are many challenges in the place I work in West Bank, and most of them are related the political reality where I live in the occupied West Bank. The Israel occupation limits our movement and apply to cover stories and the consist arrest and injury of a journalist. I was detained for hours several times, and I always shot, and I was also shot with rubber bolt by Israel arms on my leg in 2015 while covering clashes. On the other hand, and there are vague laws that are used to intimidate and restrict Palestinian journalists, both of Israel occupation and the Palestinian Authority.
And Naseh, what are some of the challenges that you found? I mean, you work as a freelancer in a difficult environment, but could you say a little bit more about the challenges, but also what keeps you going, the good side?
Well, one of the challenges I've been facing so far is being a journalist without carrying a press card. I have applied for several press cards from Ministry of Information here in Sana'a, as well as from Yemeni Journalist Syndicate or Yemeni Journalist Union. So all my credentials are complete. There is no, they did not provide any logical reason for not providing me a press card. Of course, I'm facing a lot of harassment, a lot of abuses for just not carrying a press card. And even though I'm still working with no press card, I will continue to challenge the status quo. And one of the good things is that I found the warring sides have united to target independent journalism, because the two warring sides are depending on their own media or the state media, and the two sides are not interested in an independent media or for an independent journalist. So I like to work, to continue working, no matter what the challenges are I am facing.
Have you had any restrictions on your work, Oscar? Are the press freedom questions you have to address in your work?
I wouldn't say press freedom directly, but I think working in dangerous environments, it definitely becomes a challenge. You know, Mexico is the most or the second most dangerous country for journalists in the world, with the amount of journalists being killed, and with the level of violence because of drug cartels and things like that. Oftentimes when you're reporting in certain environments, you do have to be pretty careful. I don't think it's affected the nature of my work, but it definitely is a pressing concern, whether in Mexico or in other times when I've been in sort of more conflict situations.
Right, of course. And I wanted to touch on safety as well, because that's something we think about a lot at One World Media. We want to make sure that your journalists are protecting themselves and not taking personal risks, but we also want to make sure you can get those stories as well.
So I wanted to hear about what safety precautions you have to take and how it has affected your reporting.
Yes, when I am going to covering clashes, I wear the bulletproof vest and bring it tear gas mask. It took me a long time to save up and buy them. My first job is refused to buy them for me, so I save up and buy them. And I also make sure if I am going to clashes, I tell others where I am going to be. And on the other hand, I try to be professional in my stories to avoid being subject to any kind of violation by authority.
Yeah, and as a freelance journalist, you mentioned that the place that you work didn't provide you with the safety equipment, but what support have you been given as a freelance journalist along the way?
Yes, I am very grateful for the support I get in the last year from Middle East Eye. They prefer the work of local journalists like myself, and you didn't see that in another media website. They are always very open to new idea, and I find that very supportive.
So, Naseh, I wanted to hear more about how safety plays a part in your stories and whether it has affected your reporting style. What precautions do you have to take?
Actually, for the last 2 years, I have never taken any precautions because I have entered because I am living in a highly military zone. For example, in Sana'a, a lot of the mountains on the outskirts of Sana'a have been targeted, and the Sana'a is being like a military zone. Okay, there is no difficulty. And when I went to the border between Yemen and Saudi Arabia, and was about 60 kilometer from the borders, it was the Houthis who refused to let me get inside or deeper into the heart of the military battle. Actually, I entered the military zone without taking any precaution measures, only my camera, my handbag, and my cell phone. And I would have taken all the precautions if they were provided, like armored, like the helmet, like the armored, and you name it. So it was very difficult to find these equipments. I have read and knew about them, but it was very difficult to find them. And in regard to safety, the first time for me to take safety precautions was during covering COVID-19. Okay, the last 2 months, I was able to take these precautions because it is very difficult, very critical for my safety, for my well-being. Sometimes it is clear that COVID-19 is worse than the war because there is no distinction between all the people. It can target or it can be transferred or transmission to other people. But in regard to military zone, it is different.
Yeah. So, what precautions are you taking for COVID-19? What stories are you reporting right now?
Yeah, I have reported about 4 or 5 stories since February for Monitor and Voice of America. In Sana'a, I have a story. I entered to the hotel where the Houthis health ministry has reported recording the first case on May 5th. And I entered the hotel where he reported the first case for Somalian nationality. And after 15 days, I was able to enter the hotel. I was carrying a face mask, gloves, and a headscarf. But I was surprised. All the people in the hotel were not taking any precautionary measures at all. Okay, from those people who were put under forced quarantine for 14 days, they told me harrowing stories during the 14 days. For about 120 civilian or men were put in this hotel, about 6 story. And it was a very difficult experience to hear these stories.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, it's good. I was thinking about safety, Oscar, in terms of not only yourself as a journalist and also the people that you're covering in your stories, whether they're concerned about their safety as well. How does it affect how you report?
Actually, this is for Oscar. I'm sorry.
Yes, sorry.
That's fine. No worries. So I think, the first rule I would follow is to not do any more harm than, with your work. And so in terms of any kind of reprisals that people might fear, always asking them, particularly when I've done stories about, women who are victims of domestic violence, or LGBT people, or even HIV positive people who maybe don't want to share that kind of information with their work or their family because of how it might, impact them. Always asking them if it's okay to use their first and last name, and if not, can we just use their first name or a pseudonym, and kind of try and provide that anonymity that'll keep them protected is something I definitely think about.
Yeah, of course. And Naseh, you must also think about the people who are contributing to your story and their safety.
The safety of the people who are contributing to my story, sometimes it is different from military zone or the COVID-19 crisis. The first time I enter the hotel or the hospitals or whatsoever, I try to give some awareness for my sources, okay? Of course, it is very hard to convince them. But in regard to the military zone, when you enter a military zone, and if I were carrying protection equipment, it will be you will be seen as a superior, okay? The sources will think that you are only caring for myself, for your safety, but when you came a normal citizen to them, they will feel that you are one of them, okay? And there is no distinction between you and them, and you will find them ready to speak with you, okay? And to be honest with you, when I go to the field without taking any precaution measures, and especially in the military zone, I focus more on the story rather than on my safety, okay? I will find myself being very able to get a very interesting story, but taking sometimes precaution measures, it take you another side, okay? And instead of focusing on your story. This is my own view, okay, by the way. And I like and respect all those people who are taking safety.
Good, good. Oscar, do you recognize some of that?
Of course.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also always like a kind of balance between trying to stay safe, but you know, we're journalists and we will do pretty much anything to get the story. So I think just having like a hyper awareness, you know, and trying to just assess a situation when you get there, and feeling whether something feels not quite right, I think is really important. Just relying on your instincts. And then I feel really lucky now having the foundation behind me that I have someone kind of looking over my shoulder. So just being able to check in with them at the same time every day so that they know I'm still okay and everything's going well. I can share my location with them through an app on my phone in case anything were to happen. And, you know, taking precautions like, you know, not driving at night, working with local people who maybe know the environment better, all of that can help. But at the end of the day, there are only sort of certain precautions that you can put in place, and you know, they're only, you know, there as a support system. But you know, we're really just working hard to get the story at the end of the day, whatever it takes.
Yeah, of course. And more generally, as a freelancer, what support have you appreciated along the way? Have there been organizations that you've worked with that have provided that support system? Oscar, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. I mean, definitely having the backing of organizations along the way has been what has saved my career. I think as a freelancer, there's often just not the financial or you know, logistical resources to do a lot of this work, and so applying to grants has really helped me be able to do the kind of work, whether it's the Fund for Investigative Journalism or the Society for Environmental Journalism, things like organizations like that can really support your work. And I've also was lucky enough to get a bursary from the Times of London 2 years ago, and that included doing HEFAP training. And that was really, really great to be able to do that training and get a sort of solid understanding on first aid and how to work in conflict situations before coming back to Mexico to start working here and having a better awareness of how to stay safe.
Yeah, we definitely recommend anyone who can to do those HEFAP training courses, definitely. Naseh, what support would you have liked to have seen along the way to support you as a freelance journalist?
Well, I would like to appreciate those news outlets that that commission journalists in the first or immediately, whether in the first or second or third day, because being commissioned immediately, you will find the enthusiasm for doing the story, okay, on the ground or while writing it, because then if there is any delay in commissioning you for the story after 3 days, you will find that the story is not that interesting. And I can bet you that the stories that I was commissioned on the first day or second day, you will find that it is absolutely different story. It affects the readers, and you make the reader feel he's the characters of the story. But when being delayed, I can go back to my stories and find that any story that was commissioned after 4 days or a week, you will find that you don't have that enthusiasm, and the story is not that interesting. And what we needed, as Oscar said, is the funding. As a journalist living in World Rapid Yemen, and news outlets can't send funds directly to Yemeni banks, and you have to find a third party. Sometimes I struggle for 2 months, okay, reaching my news outlets to find a proper way to transfer funds. It is due to the streets, due to the restrictions on in Yemen because of the war. We hope this can be solved.
Yeah, that's a particularly difficult, frustrating situation. You have the stories and the connection that should be able to make those processes work for you. Oscar, you were nodding furiously through that about commissioning. Do you feel that the commissioning process can frustrate the story sometimes?
A little bit. I think sometimes, editors have a lot of responsibilities and are, looking at many things at the same time, but they don't always see what's happening on the ground. And, news can change so quickly that it's very frustrating when you have a great story and then, there's a delay either in the editing or the commissioning or even the publishing, that by the time the story is published, there's been a new development, so you have to rewrite certain things, and that can definitely be a frustrating experience.
Yeah, I can imagine. This is going to be my last question. We were talking about how to find your voice as a young journalist and learn from your experience as you've gone through your career. So I'd like to end this by just asking each of you what your tips would be for journalists who are on the beginning of their career. Naseh, what would your tip be for an aspiring journalist?
Okay, we are also just starting our career, okay, but I have to give my own view on this, okay. Actually, my advice for new career journalists and myself is that you have to love journalism. The love is the secret behind your success in journalism. There are a lot of journalists who did not study journalism, but you will find them very successful because they love journalism. And you will find that, for example, I know a lot of journalists who got excellency while studying journalism, but when you tell them, can you do a breaking news or write a news story, they will fail, okay? So they get excellency. But you will find those journalists who came from outside journalism, they did not study journalism, but they have the love for journalism. You will find that they are doing their work better than those who don't love journalism. I would like to, I'm remembering my advice of my teacher who told us when I was at the first year of English department, he kept telling us that he was the teacher of writing, okay, writing subject. He kept telling us, just read, and I would like to say it here, just read, and read for those journalists who you love, okay? Love and reading is something very interesting.
Brilliant. Yeah, good advice. Shatha,
what advice do you have for journalists starting on their career?
The two biggest obstacles for a journalist are fear and the concept of being object. The truth that was that we as a journalist, like others, have the right to feel fair, but sometimes fair is an obstacle to telling the truth. If we let fair overcomes us, we become part of the system of injustice against the weak and oppressed.
Oscar, what would you add?
I guess my advice would be don't give up, even when it's really hard. I think when I was starting and I was sending pitches, at first I was just so disheartened when I would either not hear back or get a no from editors at publications that I really wanted to write for. But then I started to realize that even when you get a no, at least then you start to be on someone's radar and they start to know who you are. And if you keep pitching, eventually then, you know, you're at the stars line up and you get to write for them. And I think that's just a really great experience to just, you know, persevere. And I think also trying to find people that you really respect and, you know, just writing to them, maybe even if you don't know them, just asking them for advice, going out for a coffee or whatever it is, having a quick meeting and just kind of establishing those connections, because oftentimes those networks are the ones that'll keep you inspired, that'll give you the best advice on where to go in your career and also lead you to, you know, job opportunities in the future. So I think definitely building up your network within journalism is really important.
That's great. Thank you both. That's really, really great advice from all of you. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us for this discussion as part of the One World Media Awards 2020. Really appreciated getting more insight into your work and what drives you. And I think we all have a lot more reading to do. I'd encourage everyone to take a look at all of our nominees' work. Oscar, Naseh, Shatha, thank you all for applying to the awards, and congratulations again on being nominated for the New Voice Awards. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for you and for everyone in One World Media.